Hello YouTube, this is Wally Garneau, the Daily Libertarian. I did a couple of videos yesterday. I tried two different formats. One I was essentially reading from a script. The other one I would just talk to the camera about a topic I know fairly well. Reading from a script didn't seem to work very well, so I'm not going to do that today. Today I'm going to just read to the camera on a topic I know pretty well. Before I do, I'd like to give a shout out to Randy Olson. He's my first Patreon subscriber. Thank you, Randy. You're going to help support the site. That's a great thing, so we're going to do great things together. Today I want to talk about something I think is very important. It might be kind of a mundane topic, something that people don't think about very often. But to understand politics, to understand current events, and to understand what's going on with our economy and the world around us, it's important this topic is understood. The topic is inflation and also our monetary system. Those two things go together, so I'm going to talk about both of them a little bit. We'll start out with inflation. Uh, when I use inflation, I usually use an example of two apples and $2. I don't have any apples at the moment. My wife is out of them, so I found instead two mangoes. So I want you to imagine that we have a tiny microeconomy that consists of exactly two mangoes and $2. Two mangoes and $2. If we had exactly two mangoes and $2, and that was the entirety of our economy, how much do you think one mango would cost? If you answered $1, you're exactly correct. If we had two mangoes and $2, and that was the entirety of our economy, mangoes would cost $1 a piece. If we were to take the same economy, and instead of having $2, maybe we expanded the money supply to $4, how much would a mango then cost? Assuming everybody knows that we've expanded the monetary supply to $4, they would then charge $2 for a mango, because there would be two mangoes and $4, that's $2 to each mango. That's exactly how inflation works. If we were to do the opposite, and we were to have, say, four mangoes and $2, and the mangoes all of a sudden would cost 50 cents a piece, because there would be 50 cents to each mango. Four mangoes, $2. That would be deflation, the opposite of inflation. So when you add money faster than the economy grows, in our case mangoes, then you have inflation. When you add mangoes, or whatever your economy is, faster than you add dollars, then you get deflation. If you want to have a stable monetary system, then you want your money supply to grow at the same pace that your economy does. If you get two more mangoes, you need two more dollars. If you get two more dollars, you need two more mangoes. That's how inflation works. And believe it or not, but it really is that simple. What's not simple is the economy. We don't really have only two mangoes, and we don't really have only $2. As a matter of fact, it can be very difficult at any point in time to determine exactly how many of any commodity we have, or any good or service we have. And it's the entirety of all goods and services produced that determine the size of our economy. It can also be very difficult to determine exactly how much money we have. Well, the money supply that we're looking at is what's known as the M2 money supply, which I don't want to throw a lot of complex terms out there, but essentially that's the money supply after it's multiplied by fractional banking. It's a little more complicated than that, checking, not saving. There are various complexities that go to the M2 money supply, and I don't want to get too complex. But suffice it to say that the M2 money supply is essentially the money supply after it is multiplied out by fractional banking. We'll get into that a little bit too. As far as inflation goes, what people need to understand about inflation is that it acts exactly like a tax. It acts like a tax both on income and savings. So if we have inflationary pressures and inflation starts to hit the economy, that essentially means that you're making less money. Now, if you're rich, you can hedge against it by buying gold, commodities, mutual funds that trade in commodities. Anything that moves, gold is great because gold moves almost immediately with Federal Reserve policy changes. After gold, there are other things that move into that a little bit too. But the point is that if you're rich, you can kind of hedge against inflation. You can actually make money on inflation. But if you're a working person like I am, and like most of the people watching this video probably are, you will eventually catch up with inflation. Your wages will eventually compensate you for it, but in the meantime, you're going to earn less money relative to the cost of goods and services. And that means that you're essentially being taxed. So inflation is essentially, for all intents and purposes, it is a tax. And it's a tax on consumption, it's a tax on earning, it's a tax on middle and lower class America. So that's what inflation is. The complex part of inflation is how it moves through the economy. Inflation starts out with gold. As I said, Federal Reserve policy changes, gold moves immediately. I mean, you can watch gold. You can watch the Federal Reserve makes an announcement, price of gold changes. It's like bam, right now. If you're not tied right into the backbone of the stock exchange, you're not even be able to buy gold fast enough to do anything when the Federal Reserve announces something. By the time you can do it, gold's already moved. So gold moves immediately. Silver moves next, and other precious metals. After those, non-consumable commodities like crude oil, those will follow. After that, consumable commodities like meat, eggs, potatoes, those start to move. And only after consumable commodities move does labor move. Labor is the biggest driving force of inflation. People sometimes call inflation transitory before it hits labor. But then it hits labor, and all of a sudden, everything that has labor in it shoots up in price. That's not just cars and television sets either. That's also all of the commodities, the consumable commodities like milk and eggs. There's some labor in those, so those shoot up as well. Cost of everything increases. That means that people are going to want more money, so the cost of labor goes up yet again. Once inflation hits labor, it goes through in waves. And if you wonder where we are in inflation right now, just go to the grocery store and compare it tonight to 2008. The cost of labor hasn't changed that much since 2008. Wages haven't changed that much since 2008. But consumable commodities have gone up a great deal, and that represents inflation that's already baked into the system. When that inflation hits labor, hold on to your hats. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Eventually, labor will catch up with the cost of consumable commodities, but it'll take a while. That gets us into the M2 money supply and how our money system works. We don't have a fiat money system. A lot of people think that we do. It's not really fiat. We do have $865 billion of paper and coin currency. That money is fiat. There's nothing backing it whatsoever. It is a fiat money supply. Nothing you can do about that. That is what it is. We don't have a gold backing. We don't have a silver backing. It is fiat. That means it's not backed by anything. It's just paper. It's backed by the word of the United States government. But that's only $865 billion, and there are about $100 trillion in circulation within the M2 money supply, which again is money after it's inflated by fractional banking. The M2 money supply is what drives inflation. That is essentially the measure of all money in circulation. That money is driven by debt. It's backed by the need to repay that debt. The seed of that money supply is federal debt. The Federal Reserve will buy savings bonds, which means that the Treasury is selling savings bonds. So the Federal Reserve buys Treasury bonds, ideally off the free market. They can buy them directly from the Treasury if they have to. That then puts money into the economy, into the banks. The banks then will loan that money out, ideally. They'll loan that money out, and that money then expands into the economy. People that take out loans, most of the money they take out in those loans, you buy a car or something, that money ends up back in the bank somewhere, gets loaned out again and again and again. In 2008, it was about $1,030. I think I'm pulling this out of memory. It might be a little bit different, but it's about $130 or $1,030. I'm sorry. An actual Federal Reserve created money would drive about $100,000 in the economy. Now, the Federal Reserve wants to have about a 2% increase in the money supply every year. They want about a 2% rate of inflation. That means that they have to grow the money supply by 2% plus whatever the economy grows. Because if the economy grows, that's like having more mangoes. You need more dollars to compensate. So if the economy grows at, say, 3% under Trump, then you want to have a 2% rate of inflation. That means the money supply has to grow by 5%. That doesn't mean that the federal government can spend 5% of the economy willy-nilly. It means that it can seed a little bit of money in order to grow 5% after fractional banking. It also, another important factor in terms of our money supply is the bank lending rate. The bank lending rate is not what it was in 2008. It has not come back to that level, but if it does, then all of the money that the Federal Reserve has pumped into the system is going to cause, again, more inflation. The Federal Reserve, however, can also restrict the money supply, which it does by selling Treasury notes. It buys Treasury notes and puts money into the economy. It can also sell Treasury notes. When it sells Treasury notes, it literally pulls money out of the economy. And again, when it does that, gold will drop in price immediately, and then other things follow. So the Federal Reserve does have the capability, at least in theory, of preventing inflation. The problem with that is the Federal Reserve is more afraid of deflation than inflation. So it's more concerned with more mangoes than dollars than it is having more dollar growth than mango growth. As a consequence, Consumable commodities have already gone up in price. That probably isn't going to change. I don't think the Federal Reserve is going to want to reduce the price of consumable commodities, which means that the inflation that's already baked into the economy is going to eventually go through. Now, it can take a long time for inflation to go from consumable commodities to labor. Most of you are probably not old enough to remember the 1980s. I unfortunately am old enough to remember the 1980s. I'm not old enough to remember Vietnam, but Lyndon B. Johnson funded Vietnam by printing money. And again, Nixon had to take us off the gold standard actually because Lyndon B. Johnson funded Vietnam by printing money, and we were going to have a run in our gold reserves if Nixon didn't take us off the gold standard, which he did the year I was born in 1971. We didn't actually see inflation from that until Jimmy Carter was president. So you had Lyndon B. Johnson, and then you had Richard Nixon, and then you had Gerald Ford, and then all of a sudden Carter's president, and inflation takes off. That's because the inflation can occur overseas first. It can occur with our trading partners. It can occur in countries like, say, Mexico or today China, where it's cheaper to produce. It does not have to occur here first. We actually, since we have one of the richest economies and richest workforces in the world, inflation tends to happen last year. We're a trailing indicator of wage inflation globally. So under Carter, we saw that we could in fact have high rates of inflation and high rates of inflation and high rates of unemployment at the same time. Theoretically, according to Keynes, that was impossible, but yet it happened. So we know now that it can. The point of all this is that the Federal Reserve, or the money supply, has to grow in order for the economy to grow. And we have a debt-based money supply, which means in order for the economy to grow, debt has to grow. To a certain extent, that means federal debt has to grow. But in a much larger extent, that means that personal debt has to grow. In order for some people to be rich, other people have to be in debt. And with the debt-based money system, there's no way around that. Unless you want to have inflation or deflation, the rate of growth of the economy and the rate of growth of the money supply are inexorably linked. You can't have one without the other. And if the economy grows faster than the money supply, you get deflation, and deflation can cause recession very quickly, which is why we target about a 2% rate of inflation. That's important whenever you look at any monetary policy, any fiscal policy, really anything the Federal Reserve, or from a spending perspective, anything that the federal government does. Taxation, all of that, it's all interwoven based on the need to grow government debt at a pace that will allow the money supply to grow at the same speed that the economy does. That's about all the time we have for today, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. If you'd like to sponsor me on Patreon, you can. Again, thank you to the sponsors I already have. I'll put a link to that in the description. That's money supply, the rate of inflation, and how those things. I'll get into another video about how exactly that affects everything else. A little more detail on that a little bit later. In the meantime, have a nice evening.